Welcome to EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. I'm your host, Russ Roberts of George Mason University and Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Our website is econtalk.org, where you can subscribe, find other episodes, comment on this podcast, and find links and other information related to today's conversation. Our email address is mail@econtalk.org. We'd love to hear from you. Welcome back to the EconTalk Book Club on the Theory of Moral Sentiments with our guide, Dan Klein. Dan, thanks again for joining us.
My pleasure.
Our last podcast, we were trying to get through parts 3, 4, and 5. We got through part of part 3. We might try to go a little faster today. We'll see. So our goal today is to finish up at least part 3. I'm pretty confident we're going to do that. We hope to get to parts 4 and 5, maybe into part 6, but as we learned last time, the pace is not exactly under our control. It's a coordination problem between two partial spectators of each other trying to harmonize Dan and I, and we'll see how it goes. Dan, over to you to start talking about Part 3, Chapter 4. Is that correct?
That's correct. And I'm going to try to be more cursory than I have been. I'm getting signals from Russ that we need to squeeze the whole into something like what we originally planned, and we're way behind on that plan. So,
we'll do the best we can.
In Part 4, he writes of self-deceit and general rules. Self-deceit, essentially, he says that...
This is Part 3, Chapter 4.
Yes, I'm sorry.
Yeah, go
Part
ahead.
3, Chapter 4. Pages 156 or so.
And all page numbers that Dan gives are in the paperback Liberty Fund edition, the most recent one.
Self-deceit is when your immediate passions basically mislead your internal spectator, your man within the breast, such that the man within the breast is now unaligned with the universalist impartial spectator, sort of the true impartial spectator. And so you maybe even, your man within your breast maybe even thinks well of what you're up to, but the man within the breast, as it were, has been deceived by the immediate self, if you will. And he goes from here into discussion of how, thankfully, in society, we continually observe behaviors, take cues, and develop a sense of general rules of virtue, of good conduct, ideas of propriety for all the different virtues and all the different contexts. And so we learn these general rules, and therefore that's an avenue for then again going to a more universalist, leading to a more universalist view of the impartial spectator, where these general rules can become more and more general in principle. And then a feeling for these general rules is our sense of duty. Okay, so he finally arrives in this chapter in what is in actually the title of Part 3, a sense of duty. For the first time in any prominent way, the sense of duty to these general rules, which we are sort of inferring from our observations of society in general. That, in a nutshell, is Chapter 4.
Yeah, just a couple of quick things I wanted to add on that. I think he recognizes that his whole system he's been laying out beforehand has this little flaw, which is we can fool ourselves. We've talked on EconTalk before about pragmatism, the philosophical movement that, among other things, reminded people that reason is maybe not as powerful as we hope it would be, and we have a temptation to bias our reason with our own self-interest. And for the first time in the chapter, he talks about the ideal man within the breast, suggesting that the actual man within the breast may not be quite as disinterested and impartial as we would hope. And this one quote I think worth reading, just an observation about humanity, says, "This self-deceit, this fatal weakness of mankind, is the source of half the disorders of human life. Mm-hmm. If we saw ourselves in the light in which others see us, or in which they would see us if they knew all, a reformation would generally be unavoidable. We could not otherwise endure the sight." And he's basically, suggesting again that if we were forced to look at ourselves through the eyes of the impartial spectator, the real one, we would change our behavior. He has such a faith and belief and confidence in a person's desire to be approved by others and to be happy with how others view us, that he views that as a very powerful thing, obviously. And I guess in the last part of the chapter, he talks about how experience can at least partially temper this urge to self-deceit. But I have nothing more to say about that, and I would like to move on to chapter 5, which I found to be perhaps the most, as much as I liked the earlier part.
Okay,
this is just
let me again
amazing.
give a brief cursory overview. This is the one we're going to want to get into. It's got the invisible hand in it. Chapter 5 of Part 3 regards general rules and they're being justly regarded as the laws of the deity. He first notes that religion inculcates the general rules of good conduct, but he also affirms that the general rules are properly regarded as the laws of the deity. This is the section, perhaps, where he makes some of his most theological assertions and declarations. Meanwhile, this sense of duty based on the general rules inculcated by the deity are to a great extent all that most human beings can actually use to guide their tolerable decency. He says the coarse clay of humanity needs really to follow this sense of duty because their other sentiments, apart from a sense of duty, will be too much at variance with propriety and virtue. So he says that, for the most part, people are doing what's proper out of a tolerable regard to a sense of duty, not because, like when someone expresses gratitude, says thanks, and so on, they're more doing that out of a sense of duty than that they have this impulse of gratitude truly at the moment.
Right. That's a common theme, by the way. It runs through a whole bunch of stuff. This idea that our actual behavior is not necessarily motivated internally by the desire for the outcome, but rather by the impression it makes on others. We had this discussion last time of the weak, what do you call it? The weak spark of benevolence is not so powerful.
Yeah.
So we don't help others because we're have that always because
That's right.
of this deep desire to see them help, but for a whole complex set of reasons.
Yeah, including our own sense of just propriety.
Right.
Not only because it's instrumental, but also because just it's what's proper, and it's not really the benevolence. It's just what would be proper benevolence if I were feeling benevolent, sort of.
Yeah, and it's another example of his layering.
Yeah.
Right? You've got what you do, and you've got how people view it. You've got why you do it, and how people perceive why you do it. And it all is going on at the same time.
Yes. And in this chapter, he's got a brief thing I want to remark on, a tree in the forest, if you will, where he remarks on this sense of duty being the true glue of society, the most important duty, and source of duty. And he speaks of duty in a significant way, which suggests that the rules this duty is motivating are then like laws. And the way he speaks of law in this way is a very anti-legal positivist approach, because he's essentially saying, I count as laws duties that are enforced in this internal, sentimental, moral way.
Through social norms, approval and disapproval, approbation and disapprobation.
Yes, it's not only what the cop is going to enforce, it's not only what is enforced by government word in the books of the government's law. It's a much broader sense of duty, and he includes it, I think, quite clearly. The only other remark on this chapter is that he seems to bring a lot of it home to those whom we live with, where if you're not keeping up duty, first of all, your own internal sense of self is likely to suffer. Again, he's sort of very confident that Woody Allen's wrong in the Crimes and Misdemeanors film, that you're going to feel guilty and be miserable if you do something dastardly, even if nobody finds out. But also that the people you live with are going to love you less, essentially, if you don't properly maintain a sense of duty. And this is one of several places where he brings things home to the people you live with, as in some ways like almost a kind of final bulwark, as it were, for good conduct. Mm-hmm. It's rather interesting.
They're the cops, the non-governmental police that are closest and have the most information, right?
Yeah.
So, a stranger who you interact with doesn't know your full story, but your family, your neighbor knows a little bit more, your family knows a little bit more, and the cop knows the least because the cop has got his own incentives and is a stranger of a different kind even than just a plain stranger. So it's a monitoring device. A lot of what he's talking about in this chapter is about the ability of us to self-monitor, not just monitoring ourselves, but to monitor without, as you say, the power of the state.
Right.
Do you have anything else to say about
it? It's just that, like, the monitoring of the goodness of the state actually depends on the fact that individuals are good monitors of themselves. Yeah. It's like more of a bottom-up theory. Go ahead.
Well, to me, this chapter had one of the most stunning views of Smith's worldview, and it really helped me think about how this book relates to other work of Smith, like The Wealth of Nations, and as to our role as economists today. So I want to read a somewhat lengthy quote, Dan, and
sure,
and give a reaction to it, and then let you chime in. He starts off with a really remarkable statement, a theological statement that has he's going to exploit. He says, "The happiness of mankind, as well as of all other rational creatures." Not sure who else he's including other than mankind and all rational creatures. I don't think he meant the dolphins, but he says the happiness of mankind, as well as of all other rational creatures, seems to have been the original purpose intended by the author of nature when he brought them into existence. Now, I think he's going to base that on his empirical view of the world, that it works out pretty well. So he's saying that obviously when God designed the world, he must have had this in mind. And then he gets, I think, comes to a rather remarkable invisible hand metaphor. He's not going to use the phrase invisible hand. He's going to use that coming up soon. We're going to talk about that. But he says this has this similar style and language to when he talks about the invisible hand explicitly. He says, "But by acting according to the dictates of our moral faculties, we necessarily pursue the most effectual means for promoting the happiness of mankind, and may therefore be said, in some sense, to cooperate with the deity and to advance as far as in our power the plan of providence." So what he's saying there is that, we're stuck with this impartial spectator in our breast or hanging over our shoulder, and that induces us to act in ways that make the world a better place, and that's sort of within the fabric of the universe, implanted there by God to get us to do the right thing and make the world more harmonious. And then he ties it into the economics, and this is the part I want to make sure we talk about. He says, "If we consider the general rules by which external prosperity and adversity are commonly distributed in this life, we shall find that notwithstanding the disorder in which all things appear to be in this world, yet even here every virtue naturally meets with its proper reward and the recompense which is most fit to encourage and promote it. And this too so surely that it requires a very extraordinary concurrence of circumstances entirely to disappoint it. What is the reward most proper for encouraging industry, prudence, and circumspection, success in every sort of business? And is it possible that in the whole of life these virtues should fail of attaining it? Wealth and external honors are their proper recompense, and the recompense which they can seldom fail of acquiring. What reward is most proper for promoting the practice of truth, justice, and humanity, the confidence, the esteem, and love of those we live with? Humanity does not desire to be great, but to be beloved. It is not in being rich that truth and justice would rejoice, but in being trusted and believed, recompenses which those virtues must almost always acquire." So he's making the extraordinary claim here, to me, is the way I'm reading this passage, that the world has been, whether it's been created or just happens to be, it has these built-in incentives that align our behavior in classic economic senses, incentives that create the production of virtue and prosperity. And he argues, of course, they're set in motion by God. And so you've got industry, prudence, and circumspection. Those things lead to business success. He admits it doesn't always, but over a lifetime, if you're industrious, prudent, and circumspect, you're going to prosper. And if you're in honesty and moral behavior, the return to that is honor and respect from one's fellows. Now, he says, though, those you live with, whether that means your family, your circle of friends, is not clear to me. But it's clear here that in both the economic sphere, what we would call the business world or the economy at large, and then the less visible, the connections between us as social beings interacting with each other, we're induced to do the right thing by either a financial return or by a return of being loved by those we treat well. And that's, to me, a rather extraordinary parallel of those two sort of worlds, the external world of commerce that we've touched on in our first podcast, and then this less visible, it's still the external world, but this less visible, less tangible world of our moral actions, and that somehow in both cases we're induced without the power of the policeman, without the legislation of the state, we're induced through natural incentives that are built into our conscience and the economic fabric to do things that improve the lot of humanity. And that's the way I read that. I found that to be a rather extraordinary passage.
Yes, it is. And James Ottison's 2002 book on Smith, Adam Smith's Marketplace of Life, picks up on exactly this. He's saying that Adam Smith is declaring, developing an invisible hand of morals very parallel to an invisible hand theory in economics, in the market. So, there's a great deal of parallel, and I think that's correct. I think Adam Smith's totally affirming these invisible hand mechanisms in both realms, and how exactly they interact or if they're distinct and so on are interesting questions. I think probably you would want to make them distinct to some extent. But
what's interesting is that in Hayek, or in the classroom when we're talking about the harmony that comes, say, in supply and demand as prices adjust, there's this price mechanism that's inducing this harmony. And what Smith's talking about here, the only step he really takes toward that is prosperity. That if you work hard and you're prudent, you make wise business decisions, there's a return that's commensurate. Most of the time, not always, he admits, but most of the time, the harder you work, the more you get. The more prudent you are, the more you get. So there is a natural return that's commensurate with the amount. That's the closest you'd get to saying there's some sort of equilibrating mechanism in this passage akin to, say, prices adjusting that we talk about in a microeconomics class. But in the moral sphere, it's not as obvious. True, you get more praise and more honor, but there's clearly nothing like a price.
That's right.
There's an implicit, what Becker would call a shadow price for some of these.
There's no medium of exchange.
There's no medium of exchange. There's no property rights. You can't sell you can in a certain way. You can sell your honesty if you want, but it's not analogous to the harmony that takes place in a market setting where buyers and sellers come together and find their wants and efforts aligned and in order. So it's like a whole another level up. But here he's simply talking about the fact that there's an incentive to be prudent, an incentive to be honorable and honest. And we'll talk about it more because he's going to come back explicitly in another chapter and talk about it.
Yeah. I mean, at some point we should just say that, Smith's basic explanation is that God created it this way. I mean, even for the economics, in a sense, he's sort of God created everything, set up everything to work out this way, and he essentially says God did it as best as he could have.
He's always finding a silver lining. If he finds something in the human nature that he finds unattractive, he'll then say, "But there's more. There's still something good about that. That there's a reason God put it there in us."
Yes, and naturally, an alternative point of view is to say that all of this is evolutionarily developed, including our own sense of good and working out,
absolutely,
and social utility. And there's a huge debate in the Smith literature about how serious Smith was about the providential source of all this. And it matters in some respects, but we probably shouldn't try to delve into it.
It's fascinating.
Yeah.
But I'm not so worried about what Smith really meant. This is what he at least thought was useful for people to think about. Hayek, in the beginning of The Fatal Conceit, clearly talks about how these norms and incentives could emerge evolutionarily as cultures that had the better incentives thrived and those that didn't would struggle. So it's clearly there can be more than one mechanism, obviously,
right.
to
and
get
there
here.
are a couple of, as we've noted, a couple of evolutionary hints in this book.
Yeah, and he's definitely got. There's some coming up in part 6, which I'm sure we'll talk about.
The only other thing on what you say is that all this suggests that there's a correspondence between the impartial spectator and the being whose hand is invisible.
Yeah, it's fascinating to me that he doesn't argue that God is watching us and that's why we behave well.
Indirectly, though, he kind of does. It's that way.
Either in the positive sense rather than a normative sense, or a theological sense, he could have said the reason people do the right thing is they're afraid they're going to be punished and go to hell. He doesn't say that, either because he knows that most people don't feel that intensely enough, or most people don't feel it at all. So he does not invoke that argument for good behavior, although he occasionally talks about religious people. But he's just talking about monks, it seems to me, people who've adopted an explicitly religious life. In the Britain of his day, fundamentalism wasn't particularly common. It was, I assume, it was mainly among the monks and others, the preachers and ministers. But he's got, to me, another layer. He's got the man within the breast, in his vision, is divinely implanted there. But the man within the breast is not. It's a man within the breast. Right. It's you being aware of how others view you, not God standing over you, judging you. And he explicitly does not say that as the main motivator of human decency.
Yeah. Should we go on to chapter 6?
Yeah, I just want, before we do, I want to read one quote, which I know you love, even though we haven't talked about it explicitly. And I think I made reference to it last time, but I think before we leave chapter 5, it bears mentioning. Sure. He says, "The natural course of things cannot be entirely controlled by the impotent endeavors of man. The current is too rapid and too strong for him to stop it. And though the rules which direct it appear to have been established for the wisest and best purposes, they sometimes produce effects which shock all his natural sentiments." So that's Smith talking about the law of unintended consequences, the difficulty of overturning market forces, and how political solutions, well motivated, are often going to be overturned, even though they may be very well intended. They're often going to be overwhelmed by the reality of human.
Okay, that'd be one interpretation.
Is there another?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure he's confining what you just read to, what happens in the free market.
Absolutely.
It could be, what happens in politics also.
What happens in your parenting or your buddies or your business. Or
Yeah. His invisible hand is a lot broader than the Hayekian invisible hand. It's sort of everything. Morals, culture, history, political institutions. I mean, you can look at how it works in the Wealth of Nations within the more Hayekian economic context, but that is still just sort of a part of a broader Smithian notion of invisible hand.
Absolutely. I totally agree. Let's move on to chapter 6. So we are now in part 3, chapter 6.
Okay. So here
Some good stuff in here for you, Dan.
Okay. He's addressing whether we should confine our motives, whether it's proper to confine our motives just to this sense of duty, that is duty to propriety in the various virtues, okay, and rather than actually allowing sort of genuine, spontaneous sentiment to supplement or override that sense of duty. Is it okay to allow other sentiments into our motives He says it depends, first of all, on the natural agreeableness or disagreeableness of the passions we're considering here. For social passions, friendship, kindness, appreciation, gratitude, he thinks it's nice that the genuine impulse also supplements the sense of duty, basically. But for the unsocial passions, indignation, hatred, and so on, he basically says, no, you should just do those as much as the sense of duty permits you. You should be restrained by the sense of duty, and you shouldn't let the passions itself, there shouldn't be wrath. Wrath is like the excess, like the passionate resentment or indignation.
And I assume I don't remember now, but he's saying that because of the way we judge people who are wrathful, right? The person who has a reason to be wrathful but is only angry, we respect because they've restrained it. And on the other hand, and he's always doing this sort of parallel, too much, too little, somebody who's mistreated but just turns the other cheek, he's critical of. He said, more accurately, we're critical of that person. So again, it's this very Aristotelian...
and it makes us sympathetic to the person he's wrathful to.
Correct.
Because that person is now being sort of unfairly...
overly critical.
Condemnated, condemned.
Yeah. But it's a sort of Aristotelian moderation, this Greek idea of moderation between the extremes, which he doesn't explicitly say, but it's definitely in there.
And then he says that whether these other things play a role, that is, things other than the sense of duty, also depends on the looseness and inaccuracy of the general rules, which, are the sense of duty is based on. And basically he's saying that, there are many exceptions, many gray areas, and you necessarily resort or fall back on sentiments other than the general rules that make for duty. And you kind of have to cut people slack when the general rules are so vague that, they naturally sort of fly by the seat of their pants somewhat in their conduct. The only one that clearly doesn't have these gray areas and exceptions, at least among neighbors, is justice, okay, by which, of course, he means here commutative justice. That is exact and grammatical. Here at page 175, he...
but remind listeners who maybe listened to our first podcast a long time ago, this analogy between, you said grammatical, between language, grammar versus style, and precise versus loose, vague, and indeterminate.
Yeah, he talks about two different kinds of rules. One kind are exact and precise and indispensable, and those kinds of rules in writing have their analog in grammar, and in ethics, in justice, in commutative justice. Okay, you don't break grammar, and you don't mess with other people's stuff. And that's rather exact. Messing is pretty clearly defined. Other people's stuff is pretty clearly defined, just as sentence, grammar is pretty clearly defined. And that clarity is quite different than for the other kind of rules, which are loose, vague, and indeterminate. And there, in writing, that is the kind of rules that critics lay down for what is sublime or elegant in writing. Okay, so it's sort of more like aspirational rules, and they're vague. And in ethics, it's all the becoming virtues, basically everything except for justice that we've talked about, including even prudence.
Because it's hard to know, as we've talked about in passing, it's hard to know what's prudent.
Yeah.
Prudence
is it's clear from the discussion that prudence is actually kind of closer to a grammar.
We can imagine. But
beneficence and gratitude, fortitude, a lot of these other things are more in the loose, vague, and indeterminate. And so basically he's saying the looser it is, the more you kind of have to go on your other passions, because your sense of duty just is not telling you clearly what to do, kind of thing.
I love this part where right in this section where he talks about two things. One is what you'd call the slippery slope, and the second is the stuff he'd been talking about with self-deception. And it's what an example he uses to show you why justice has to be like grammar. It had us to be black and white because of the dangers of the slippery slope and how you could deceive yourself. So it's really, I'm just going to read this passage. I just love it. He says, though the end of the rules of justice be to hinder us from hurting our neighbor, it may frequently be a crime to violate them, though we could pretend with some pretext of reason that this particular violation could do no hurt. A man often becomes a villain the moment he begins, even in his own heart, to chicane in this manner. The chicane being the verb that we've now lost. We have chicanery, but the verb to chicane. He says, the moment he thinks of departing from the most staunch and positive adherence to what those inviolable precepts prescribe to him, he is no longer to be trusted. And no man can say what degree of guilt he may not arrive at. The thief imagines he does no evil when he steals from the rich, what he supposes they may easily want, and what possibly they may never even know has been stolen from them. The adulterer imagines he does no evil when he corrupts the wife of his friend, provided he covers his intrigue from the suspicion of the husband and does not disturb the peace of the family. When once we begin to give way to such refinements, there is no enormity so gross of which we may not be capable. So his grammatical-like critique of injustice, that there's no gray area, is partly a moral absolute, but it's partly because I think he's saying here that if we were to say, well, it's sometimes not clear whether it's okay to steal, because if the guy's rich, doesn't really want it, it's not just that you'll do that. It's not just that you might be an adulterer if the husband doesn't know it's okay. He's really saying that once you start there, that's just the beginning. Mm-hmm. The incentive effects of that delusion are going to be extremely destructive.
If you don't, it's one thing to make grammatical mistakes from time to time with people who are learning grammar, but if people are not concerned with their grammar and feel no impulse to actually correct it and improve it, even when it's quite bad, that kind of person probably is going to write really horrible, in the other sense, in the aesthetic sense.
Absolutely.
Even apart from the bad grammar.
Well, are we done with part 3?
There's one other point in here. He says that almost the only cause of gross perversions of the proper sense of duty or of virtue are false notions of religion. Okay, those are almost the only cause which can occasion any very gross perversion of our natural sentiments. This kind of relates to something that's coming up. He's got this underlying theory that big perversions of proper sentiment don't really persist and only happen in particular things. And all this prompts me to raise the issue about political religion. He says false religion. Well, what about political religion? What about the political culture when a society is sort of more politicized, more infused with the public, and maybe has a kind of politics which invites everyone to think themselves much more part of the government and part of a political endeavor, mission, purpose, and so on, which I think is very much what we have more in the democratic age. So all this raises this big question for me, which I've hit on a couple of times about, sure, I think Adam Smith is getting at certain mechanisms that do tend to promote good morals and good culture. There are certain invisible hand mechanisms. In his book, he very much conveys the conviction that they kind of get the upper hand or have the upper hand overall. But I am a lot less confident about that in our world today, at least when it comes to a lot of these more political aspects of culture and morals, than the book suggests.
You mean than the book says explicitly? Is that what you meant?
Yeah, or suggests by implication. I mean, he's optimistic about
incredibly optimistic
the course of culture and morals, I would say.
Oh, I see what you're saying. And you're less so.
But the setting today is so different. I mean, he says the only thing that can corrupt this is false notions of religion. Well, what happens when you have a political religion that pretty much encompasses, so much of the society? so that the whole society, in a sense, is a sect, or maybe this version of the faction of the sect versus that faction of a sect. So in this sense of an encompassing political religion, maybe then they can be grossly perverted on a very broad scale forever or for a long time.
I'd love to devote a separate podcast down the road to this idea of what we lose when we choose to act collectively. It's so interesting because critics of free marketers will say that, we're just a bunch of green eye shade, money-loving, heartless folks who care about efficiency. And of course, that was not Smith's view. It is not my view. I know it's not your view, Dan. In that view, in the anti-market view, commerce corrupts. Our pursuit of money corrupts. Our commercial interactions corrupt. Our heartlessness leaves people in the dust, et cetera, et cetera. And I think they ignore the flip side. But first, obviously, I think that's a straw man and a parody of what voluntary interactions actually are about. I think they're very much about virtue and not about cruelty and heartlessness. But certainly those who are critical of decentralized market-based voluntary interactions ignore the possibility often of the corrupting effects of government on virtue, of collective action on virtue, relationships between parents and children because of Social Security, failing to care about the poor because you don't have to, because the government, they'll take care of it. All kinds of areas, I think. And that's I'd love to continue on that, but I think if I understand your point, you're saying that while Smith is an optimist, you're much less optimistic about the virtuousness of daily life.
I can't say it's been going well from my point of view. And in addition to what you're saying...
I disagree with you, by the way, in the sense that I don't believe that we got to get into this a little bit to make sure people understand what we're talking about, because Dan and I did a podcast before this book club on this idea. I think we did on the romance of collective solutions.
Yeah. And on groupthink, which is related. Because
it is. So those who are interested in getting the back story for this little piece we're going into can go through the archives and find those. But what I find, I'm going to defend Smith as an optimist even in today's age.
Okay.
It seems to me, when you made your remark about the corruption of a false religion being a destroyer of virtue, and using a belief in, say, the political process as a false religion, first thought I had is of the people who go to government to bail them out of bad decisions they made, be it the execs at AIG or the homeowners who bought a third house with no money down, and now they don't want to pay the consequences for their bad decisions. And I think that corrupts virtue. I think the moral hazard issue is real in that it reduces future prosperity, but more than that, much more than that, to me, the real danger of government as bailer out, government as parent, is that it corrupts our humanity. It destroys our incentives to act with prudence. It destroys our incentives to act carefully and not recklessly. And it distorts our incentives to help our fellow. Rather, it encourages us to lobby for and to use government, which is a zero-sum game, rather than to produce wealth, which is a non-zero-sum game. So for me, I very much agree with your concern that the idea that Washington is the benevolent bestower of goodies is extremely corrupting to our virtue. My optimism comes from the fact that most people know that's a bad game. There are people who succumb to it, just like Smith would say there are people who ignore the man within the breast, become thieves, adulterers, etc. But in the way we raise our children and in the way we interact with our spouses and the way we interact with our friends, most of us don't count on government and don't counsel our friends and children to count on government as a source of benevolence and goodness. True, it's in our culture to look to government, to see political leaders as saviors of sort, magicians, as Don Boudreau, our colleague, will often invoke their wizard-like faith we have in some kind of wizard-like ability of them to save us from this mishap or another. But I think deep down, and not just deep down, in our daily lives most of the time, they just don't have enough money, or wisdom to pull it off. So true, at times we turn that way, but I don't see it corrupting our most of our lives. I think we kind of ignore it, most of us.
I think that was very well put and has a lot of truth. And you're making a kind of distinction about, does big government lead us to not pay our loans? And you're saying not really. And I think that's a great point, and that's a good reason for this continued optimism. And in private-to-private action, I do think all these invisible hand mechanisms do generally work pretty well. Let me try to give a little
go ahead.
Back. Look, the average person is not enforcing drug prohibition and putting his neighbor in prison. And the average person perhaps doesn't think all that much about, say, that issue. And that's just one of many, many issues I could raise.
Immigration.
Yeah, also all these economic regulations, occupational licensing, OSHA, minimum wage. All these things are coercive, an initiation of coercion by the government. They're pointing a gun at people who are perfectly innocent. And it's widespread, okay, as well as taxation for all the social goodies, right? Yeah. And you're right that people, in some sense, just lead their private lives. They lead their private lives and don't worry so much about that. Now, however, they do have opinions about it. They do participate in it. It does make them. They do take interests in politics and actually develop affections and loyalties and everything else, which are often misguided, often based on very broad theories, which are wrong and foolish.
Or at least not supported by any real evidence.
Yeah, and actually do then go against a lot of these virtues. If Walmart's going to be demonized, well, Walmart's a guy engaging in voluntary things, being industrious, serving, it is a kind of perversion of some of those morals. But look, when not only the average person, your neighbor, but then also the cultural institutions, we haven't mentioned that the government, largely runs K through 12. About 70% of college professors work for the government, including us. The government plays a huge role in the culture. Think of the whole set of cultural institutions also being heavily influenced by government. Now, in this world where opinion about policy, can be very off base, which it can be, Smith, I think, didn't live in that world, first of all.
For sure. His world was a different world.
Okay, where people from the very bottom are being invited to kind of revere government, identify with government, very much of a democratic age thing where the voter is above the president, as it were. That was a concept which England did not have at all, that the guy was above the king. Or he knew he was below the king. Yeah. Right? And he did not, I think there was probably some sense of loyalty and all that, but did not feel all that attached to what the government was doing and did not, So it's very different today. Now, in this world where there's very broad notions about how things work, how things should work, are commonly believed, taken for granted, and are wrong, there is a lot more of a role for the challenger, in my view. There's a lot more of a role for the Ludwig von Mises, for the Thomas Zaws, to some extent even the Milton Friedman, who was shocking and challenging and, in a sense, arrogant when he first hit the scene. And that is missing from this book. Smith very much frowns on the guy who makes waves. He doesn't at all celebrate the sort of cultural hero who challenges a dominant foolishness, who challenges some kind of groupthink.
He's big on order. He's big on
he's very
harmony.
Confident. He's very confident about a melioristic bargaining approach.
Evolution of various kinds, implicitly.
So I do think there are real issues here, at least as because implicitly I think the book is saying not only do people tend to learn to pay their bills, but they do tend to get their opinions right about things. He's also, I think, got a kind of a optimistic view of culture.
I agree. He does, and you're saying he might be disappointed with how it's turned out.
Right.
I'm not sure. I think it's easy to be. It's a half full, half empty thing. It's easy to look around the world today and say it's miserable, and it's also easy for me to look around and say it's, for all the things that are going on. The taxation's a great example. His government's much bigger than it was 10 years ago, 25 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago, and yet, so far, it's kind of a rock in the stream. We, as Smith said, we kind of swirl around it. We kind of do our own thing despite that. It slows it down. It pushes it around in various ways, but the current keeps going. So
I feel
that's my optimism.
Yeah, I feel a little bit more unhappy about the situation. I think I want the culture to get things right. I want the culture to be harmonious. I want me and my neighbors and my family to be able to talk about the world in a way that makes sense and makes progress. And I want people to, admire and understand, the good and the bad in politics and government and leadership. And that's not particularly what's happening in my view. But
we got to keep writing.
Sure. Yeah, sure. Well, yeah. By the way, all this leads very directly, I would say, into part 4. Okay, so should we go there?
Sure.
Because let me just say a little bit about the forest, and then perhaps we'll get into some of the trees. Okay, so what part 4 is about is the effect of utility upon the sentiment of approbation.
And what does he mean? He doesn't mean utility. It's when economists
social utility, some kind of social
usefulness. Outcomes.
Yes.
Real things happening that are good.
Beneficial results. And he's taking issue again with the idea that that moral approval or approbation is based directly on utility. Again, he's disagreeing. He's disagreeing with that. His organon is that,
which means his worldview or organizing framework from last podcast. For those of you who missed it,
his principle of inquiry is that approbation or moral judgment is always enshrouded in some kind of spectatorial sympathy. That spectatorial sympathy is almost an aesthetic reaction to the beauty of the conduct, and so it is based on a notion of propriety in the action, okay? So, if you will, approbation is always enshrouded in a notion of propriety, a sense of propriety. Now, that propriety, I think Smith is saying, tends to be shaped or to conform to utility. Okay, and that's by virtue, really, ultimately, of God setting up
our incentives that are in place. And,
yes, the whole system that he set things up such that we will tend to develop notions of propriety that do serve utility, but it's not
perfect.
Right. The journey from utility to approbation necessarily makes a stopover at propriety, right? So that's what he's saying, and he's got 3 illustrations of this in the chapter. The first is the one about when the ambitious person pursues wealth and so on, it's actually more a sense of beauty and propriety in all of the means of happiness.
Bizarre view, but has real truth to it.
Let me just run through these and we'll come back to them. So, so this winds up, this is the invisible hand passage, where it winds up that at the end of his life, this guy who's pursued all of this wealth finds that he hasn't actually derived that much happiness directly from them, and that now he's got all these large fortunes which become operos machines, right?
What is operos
or operos? I think it's like big, cumbersome, hard to handle, wish you didn't even have to bother with it kind of machine. Like, dealing with all the stuff in your life.
Like having a Ferrari. The maintenance part is a bummer. It's a beautiful car.
And yet, this notion of propriety, which drove the guy, is actually good for utility because it led him to produce, to be industrious, and to generate things that sustain mankind and a larger number of people. That's one illustration. Another illustration is that prudence and self-command are things we often do, not because we're actually sensible to the long-term utility of taking care of ourselves, right? Today, if I go out and eat right or refrain from not having a piece of chocolate cake, it's not that I'm so sensible to the fact that next week I'm going to be thinner and I'm directly doing it because of that utility, but it's a sense of propriety that I've developed in a habit of prudence or self-command. And finally, he talks about how discussions of public policy and the great machine of the economy, again, inspires a sense of beauty in thinking about the whole social system or the whole economic system. And this beauty then gives us notions of propriety in thinking about public policy, the great machine. And again, the person who is then inspired with public spirit does it more from a notion of the beauty
or grandeur
of the system than that he's actually benevolent, right? Then that, he actually directly cares about the utility, which is the source of that beauty.
Yeah, and that's a big problem.
So his point is that it's always propriety, which is based actually on spectatorial sympathy, or nestled within it.
Yeah.
That is always in between approbation and utility, but he's also got this affirmation that utility tends to conform with propriety. That's the invisible hand sense in Smith. And again, to go back to what we were just talking about, my concern is that when the government runs K through 12 and everything else, utility maybe doesn't that well conform to our notions of propriety.
Well, I think a phrase we haven't used when we're talking about invisible hand, I think the other phrase we ought to mention is feedback loops. It's a modern phrase, but I think what Smith's talking about are these feedback loops that bounce us back and forth between outcomes and motives that make them align to be somewhat harmonious. That when we want a good thing, we cause a good thing.
Right.
If it doesn't, we feel guilty. And you're suggesting that in collective action, maybe those feedback loops don't work so well, and so the outcomes are not so good. Again, I just want to emphasize utility here does not mean the economist sense of the word utility, which is, it's related to it, obviously, but it's not like a utility function where it's a sort of proxy in economics for happiness or satisfaction. He is talking about things that produce those things.
Yeah.
He's talking about things, when he uses the word utility, he's talking about pragmatic, useful outcomes.
Yeah, and it's a social utility that he's talking. He's talking about social utility, some kind of aggregate utility.
Well, not in what sense?
Well, in these considerations, I guess it depends on the situation. It depends on the application, but aggregate to the people involved in the judgment, the matters being judged.
But your point about propriety versus utility is that you're motivated by what seems like the right thing to do, not whether it might actually turn out to be a good outcome, right? That's the distinction.
Yes, at least that's propriety is the first impulse.
Right.
And when we go back and think about utility, that again is always kind of based on a beauty in the utility. Okay, so it's not the raw utility directly ever that generates a moral judgment.
So do you have more to say about chapter 1?
About chapter 4?
Part 4, chapter 1.
This is basically all of part 4 that I'm going over. The only other thing I want to say, let me just get this in so that we can then... So when he's talking about people thinking about the great system and public policy, he speaks of people developing an exalted notion of propriety. He speaks of exalted propriety. And I just want to go over a little bit this logic that each notion of propriety, and by the way, that would be pertaining to certain virtue, each notion of propriety, as it were, corresponds to a referent community. Okay, so you've got sort of, if you will, community sub I, and within community sub I, propriety sub I is what is normal
for that community.
Yes, respectable, middle, above propriety sub I would be praiseworthy within community sub I. Below propriety sub I would be blameworthy in community sub I. But Smith clearly sets out here, or introduces here, or identifies here, that thinking about this, we then sometimes move up to an exalted propriety. Okay, a more select community, okay, a higher, richer, wiser in our mind, who have higher standards, community sub J. And in community sub J, there's the notion of propriety. Propriety sub J is higher than propriety sub I. And now what was praiseworthy for community I is maybe only average for community J. So this notion of exalted propriety, I think, very much speaks of that whole dialectic and unending process and refinement, and ultimately a kind of notion of a select, the wise and virtuous man that he speaks of in part 6, with who goes after perfection and so on.
And in part 6, which maybe we'll get to sometime, I'm optimistic. Maybe not today. We'll see. But in part 6, he definitely talks about that evolutionary nature within an individual, that over time, so you have community I and J who may differ in their level of propriety, and he he, as an exemplar, he mentions the individual who over time develops more self-command, more prudence, more propriety.
Exactly. It's exactly that I to J sense there.
You're going to be a different person in 20 years. You're going to refine yourself. You're going to be more in control, etc.
So we've got. Go ahead, Russ. Do you want to go into the invisible hand?
Well, I wanted to say first, for those of you who are not reading the book or just listening, the first part of chapter 1 of part 4 is really a remarkable indictment of empty materialism, and it would come as a surprise, I think, to the readers who see Smith as this free market right-winger, this bizarre parody of Smith. Here, Smith, in the first part of the chapter, and I won't read it, but it is highly entertaining, where he mocks and talks about the emptiness of the gadgets of his day. It would be the equivalent for us of your iPhone or your PDA, your BlackBerry, or some fancy, expensive watch.
I think that's a better example, actually.
Well, for him, but in his day, he talks about watches.
I mean, an iPod's a pretty useful thing, isn't it?
Well, it depends.
I don't have one, so I don't really know.
Yes. Well, to me, some of these are frivolous. And a lot of people would say that a fancy cell phone is frivolous.
Well, the fanciness, maybe.
Right. Yeah, it's the fanciness. Did I say iPod? I meant to say iPhone, maybe a fancier version of something that does something in an elegant and impressive way. He talks about how men, and it is particularly men, like toys. And again, in 1759, you think, well, what could they be carrying around that would impress their neighbors? And he has these bizarre offbeat examples. Tweezer cases and other little weird things. And he talks about their pockets being stuffed with these things, and which is ironic, again, because in our world, we got the same problem. I got my cell phone, my iPod, my GPS, my you name it, and I've got to charge them all, and it's keep their batteries going. So he indicts this, not indicts is a little strong, but he's very clear that these are not going to make you happy. And he really gets on a hobby horse of wagging his finger and saying, stay away from these, because they're really a mistake. And then he goes on to say that materialism generally, it's not just these little gadgets and things. He says, you think you're going to be happy when you acquire all this stuff. And what I wrote in the margin of one of them, I'll read a short quote here. He says, power and riches appear then to be what they are. Enormous and operose machines contrive to produce a few trifling conveniences to the body, consisting of springs, the most nice and delicate, which must be kept in order with the most anxious attention, and which, in spite of all our care, are ready every moment to burst into pieces and to crush in their ruins their unfortunate possessor. So you're sort of entangled in this. Yeah. It's almost a Charlie Chaplin Modern Times image of an indictment of sort of financial success. So, you're tangled up in this spring-like gadget, this complex operos, whatever that means, a machine that not only is it a pain in the neck, but it's going to hurt you. It's going to, not only do you have to deal with it and keep the swimming pool filter cleaned, all these things, they're all just too much trouble. They don't really lead to happiness. So it's very...
to keep up the yard.
Yeah, exactly. I wrote in the margin, nobody on their deathbed wished they spent more time at the office. This is Smith saying, this is fool's gold, this material excess. And again, for those who think that Smith is this great champion of greed or material well-being to the expense of other things, clearly here he is a huge indicter of it. But for me, the coolest part of this section, which I loved, and I love the indictment as well, because I'm prone to this gadget love too. I got my Kindle, I've got my camera, I've got too many gadgets, which produce sometimes.
Got his recording studio.
I got my recording toys, yeah. So. But what he says here, which is unbelievable, and it is really, again, an invisible hand sort of argument. He says, and in a minute he's going to actually use the term coming up, but he says, the pleasures of wealth and greatness, when considered in this complex view, strike the imagination as something grand and beautiful and noble, of which the attainment is well worth all the toil and anxiety which we are so apt to bestow upon it. So he's saying, we think it's going to make us happy. It doesn't. He says it's an illusion.
But there's a sort of beauty in it.
There's a beauty and an elegance.
And that's sort of the sense of propriety.
And we're seduced by that. as in the small by the gadget, and we're seduced by it in the grand by the palatial residence, the prestige of being wealthy. But then he says, this is what's so remarkable. He says, and it is well that nature imposes upon us in this manner. He says it's good that we have these inaccurate views. They're not bad, they're good.
That we take false gold as gold.
Yeah. He says, it is this deception. This is just a beautiful passage I have to read. He says, it is this deception which arouses and keeps in continual motion the industry of mankind. It is this which first prompted them to cultivate the ground, to build houses, to found cities and commonwealths, and to invent and improve all the sciences and arts which ennoble and embellish human life, which have entirely changed the whole face of the globe, have turned the rude forests of nature into agreeable and fertile plains, and made the trackless and barren ocean a new fund of subsistence, and the great high road of communication to the different nations of the earth. The earth, by these labors of mankind, has been obliged to redouble her natural fertility and to maintain a greater multitude of inhabitants.
That's very important.
And then, I'm going to skip down, it's on the same page, he then says, and he starts talking about ambition. He says, you think you're going to build this huge agricultural enterprise because you're, and he uses that, the eye is bigger than the stomach. He uses the belly, saying, you think you're going to consume all this output, maybe literally even is the implication, or at least figuratively that you're going to sell it and you're going to get all this stuff from it. And then he says this is this remarkable mention of the invisible hand in the context of it. He says, talking about the rich who've got this ambition to material greatness, says they consume little more than the poor, and in spite of their natural selfishness and rapacity, though they mean only their own conveniency, though the sole end which they propose from the labors of all the thousands whom they employ be the gratification of their own vain and insatiable desires, they divide with the poor the produce of all their improvements. They are led by an invisible hand to make nearly the same distribution of the necessaries of life which would have been made had the earth been divided into equal portions among all its inhabitants, and thus, without intending it, without knowing it, advance the interest of the society and afford means to the multiplication of the species. When Providence divided the earth among a few lordly masters, it neither forgot nor abandoned those who seemed to have been left out in the partition. These last, too, enjoy their share of all that it produces. In what constitutes the real happiness of human life, they are in no respect inferior to those who would seem so much above them. In ease of body and peace of mind, all the different ranks of life are nearly upon a level, and the beggar who suns himself by the side of the highway possesses that security which kings are fighting for. So this remarkable idea, very different than I think the way we modernly think about the profit motive. In the profit motive, in modern economics, we say, well, it induces, if there's competition, it induces people to serve the customer, et cetera. And I want to say as an introduction, as a side note, this is a beautiful praise of entrepreneurship, right, of the human desire to create and transform. It's really a gorgeous passage. And what he's saying is that ambition, which we often say leads people to serve the customer, here it creates jobs, it creates employment and well-being, financial and economic well-being for people who didn't get they didn't get the farm, they didn't get the estate, they're just workers. But through this invisible hand of ambition, this rich, tiny minority is sharing that produce. And what's interesting is that in our day,
as consumers too.
And in our day, that widespread material well-being is such a transformation of the world in the last 250 years. It really was only starting in Smith's time. The fact that he viewed the world that optimistically then, when there were serfs literally on the face of the earth, is really just extraordinary. It's just an amazing passage. And it's the first mention, if I'm right, of the invisible hand, right?
It's the only one.
It's the only one. That's it, huh?
Yeah, there's only 3 in all of Smith's works. 3 occurrences of the phrase.
And this is the only one in this book?
Yes.
And the other 2 are in?
No, one's in Wealth, and one's in the History of Astronomy essay.
Cool.
I don't know if we want to get into the passage. I agree with what you just said, and I like the general flavor of what Smith's saying. I do think there are a number of things about it that are not so great.
Go ahead.
I think he kind of exaggerates the point to such an extent, first of all, with in the end, the beggar who suns himself by the side of the road possesses the security which kings are fighting for. Again, I mean, let's talk to the beggars about that.
Yeah, no, that's fair enough.
And so on. But the specific of the invisible hand passage, it's a comparative claim, okay, about a supposed fact and a counterfactual. Okay, what is the supposed fact? It's that, quote, Providence divided the earth among a few lordly masters. Okay, does Smith believe that? Does he expect us to believe that? I don't know. Maybe more importantly, the counterfactual to which that other's being compared, namely, quote, had the earth been divided into equal portions among all its inhabitants. Now, does that counterfactual happen back at the beginning of God's creation? I imagine so.
Well, I thought it was a statement about, in his day, land was the major source of wealth, right? So there's been an enormous amount of agitation in the last 250 years to get the distribution of land or the distribution of wealth to be more egalitarian. A lot of people indict capitalism because the initial conditions are unfair. Some people start out with a lot and some don't. And
that's how I always and originally read the passage. And that would make sense in the sense that...
He's an apologist. He's saying it's okay.
Yeah, and in the sense that, think of there being such agitation, although I'm not sure there was that early for that.
There was in France.
Okay.
Very soon in this period, right?
I would imagine, if you say so. I'm not sure.
Russia.
But anyway, if there is that, I mean, then the counterfactual he's talking about is if it was equally divided, had the earth been divided into equal portions among its inhabitants lately, like last generation.
I think he means now. I think he's talking about
like 20 years ago.
He's talking about a Marxist.
Okay, in that case, if that's what he means, which I don't think really is that well supported by the text, but if that's what he means, what he says is even more preposterous.
Well,
right?
I'm going to challenge that. I'm going to put that behavioral economist hat on Smith that we've put on him a few times in the last few podcasts. Okay. He's saying money doesn't create happiness.
Okay, well, look, let me jump in again.
Yeah.
All right, and so he's saying, go back to the beginning of it. They are led by an invisible hand to make nearly the same distributions of the necessaries of life. Now, we can salvage all this by saying the necessaries of life is just enough to keep you alive.
It's a minimal standard.
To make you a beggar lying by the side of the highway.
Sunning yourself, though, very serenely.
True. Sunning, that helps. That's right. Overall, I think the whole thing is terribly muddled in these ways. Again,
I would say, on that last point about the king, it's this classical idea. It's an old idea. It's that, uneasy lies the head that wears the crown. And he talks a lot in the coming pages about assassinations of kings and Caesar getting killed because he overreaches. And, he's saying, they're not so happy. He's really taking a deep spiritual view of what the sources of happiness.
I agree. I just think that the overstatement seems so extreme that I'm not sure he's doing his good point of service.
Okay, fair enough.
With it all.
I hear it. It's not for somebody who's got more than the median necessities of life, be that Smith or us.
Yeah.
To then say that everybody's equally well off is a bit. It's maybe a bit absurd and it's maybe very bad marketing.
Yeah.
But I found it to be a fascinating passage.
I mean, even if you go back to the idea of each person wanting to find that propriety at sub-I and then go up to J and improve themselves and have, a meaningful, progressive life, and it's always in that next step, right, that life is really enjoyed and experienced. Well, if the beggar doesn't get to do much development, if the poor person, material means do matter to that. I mean, that's not
I totally agree.
Just a sort of a crummy slogan of the left or something. It's true. I don't agree with the policies they might propose about it. But, there's a lot to be said for money doesn't buy happiness, but that point can be overdone.
I totally agree. I'm reading it through my modern eyes, thinking of Sergey Brin and Larry Page, who create Google, become billionaires, and they have a nicer car than I do. They're funding the Tesla, the 100+ mile an hour electric car. It's a gorgeous vehicle, and they go to nicer vacations than I do, and nicer vacations and have nicer cars and fancier houses if they want than all of their employees. But their employees have really a fascinating and interesting life working there, and those of us who get to put the consumer side into it that Smith doesn't talk about in his example. We've benefited tremendously. So when people complain that they've got a disproportionate share of the pie and that the world would be a better place if they were forced to share it with the rest of the world, I like that they created that. To me, their well-being is redounds to me. And that's what I think Smith is partly saying. He may go too far there. I'll accept that. Let's move on.
Okay, we're going to tackle part 5.
Are we done with part 4? Let me just...
To my mind.
Let me look. Visible hand. Yeah, well, I got to challenge you on one thing before we go to part 5.
Sure.
Because I know you've confessed that Smith is the
Moses.
The I'll call him the patron saint, maybe.
Okay.
So the patron saint of a classical liberal view. In chapter 1 of part 4, he talks about the perfection of police, the extension of trade and manufacturers are noble and magnificent objects. He praises some of the public works side of government, and it seems like he says, the same principle, the same love of system, the same regard to the beauty of order, of art and contrivance frequently serves to recommend those institutions which tend to promote the public welfare. And he talks about all this. He talks about the public roads, all this government stuff. He seems to be positive. Do you want to have thoughts on that?
Yeah. First of all, the way he's speaking of that, I think he's talking about public policy generally, not specifically that it should be government works. I mean, I don't think he's saying that when you observe and think about, the government sector and its growth and expansion, you get filled with this sense of beauty and public spirit. I think he's just saying public policy, whatever good public policy is, but the effect public policy has on the whole society, the whole system. Okay, so it's got he's pulling back and taking this super wide-angle view, that fourth source of moral approval that we were talking about at the very beginning, the very wide fourth source of all the effects of an action. And he's saying that thinking about this, discussing this with people, exploring it yourself, does create an interest in how things work in the big picture, a more whole and hence less partial view of all the consequences of, say, public policy. And so I don't see any rub against liberalism here, classical liberalism. And in fact, I like this aspect in Smith. I think classical liberalism as a set of political positions and political outlook, very much ought to have this semi-anthropomorphic view of the whole. Not that society is an organism, but that there is a kind of organism, if you will, that views the whole, not in its details, but only in an abstract way, but thinks about the whole, with whom we then sympathize. I mean, that's sort of our sympathizing with this imagined being whose hand is invisible, okay? In fact, I think in libertarian circles, people have veered too much away from these sort of anthropomorphic notions, these kind of social aggregate notions.
Hayek's critique of the word social alone, I think, has caused some people to be suspicious of it as an adjective. Social is an adjective.
I think he veers,
social justice.
And he was less that way earlier, but he did veer that way more the more he got into his critique of socialism. But it's even more so in Mises, at least after his book Socialism. He veers very much against and Rothbard. This is kind of one of the main camps, if you will, within the Austrian economics movement. And I think Smith tells us we should think in these kind of sort of social organism terms, in the sense that we're creating these or imagining these spectators, these beings, okay, with a kind of social view. And these beings have very superior knowledge by assumption and a kind of benevolence. Now, they don't have any power, or if they have any power...
They're withholding it, yeah.
What's that?
They're withholding it. They're constraining themselves.
Yeah, or, I mean, if you want to turn this being with the invisible hand into the impartial spectator, then they have this moral power, this emanating moral power, right, that affects us in our breast. Yeah. That would be their power. But anyway, this being does not sound anything like government. So it's a kind of, if you like, I don't know what the right good word is, social organism, anthropomorphism, but can we develop that without falling into a kind of statist social anthropomorphism that identifies the government or the state, the group of people in the polity, including the citizens, as the being with the government as its actual power, its arm.
Implementer, yeah.
Yeah. And I think that actually the Austrian movement has veered too much away from that, including Kerzner, I would say, in a lot of his. And you know who else veers away from this in a very anguished way, I think, is James Buchanan. He's got a great tension within him, I think, of actually going with the kind of social anthropomorphism view and using it, and then also totally bridling at it and saying this is totally unscientific and there's nothing but individual action and individual experience and so on and so on. And you can't really socially aggregate or only in some like very way that's really not like in so much in the Smithian way. So that's what I think about when he talks about that. I think the discussion of the grand affairs does inspire humanity and generosity. I think maybe he calls it there, I'm not sure, public spirit. And a sense of beauty, we have to develop as economists, public policy analysts, whatever, social scientists, notions of what is a more beautiful social system.
We just have to be careful, though, as Ed Leamer said in a recent podcast, we don't confuse our model with reality. I think we have a tendency to create a beautiful model and assume that would create a beautiful social organism in it. That's a good. We'll be talking about the man of system shortly. It would be, I think, one of the dangers of that strategy.
It's a very vague tapestry, okay? And so even to think of it as like some kind of rigorous model, I mean, I don't. Yeah. Anyhow,
okay. Well, let's move on to part 5.
Okay,
which
sure.
I have almost nothing to say about. I found it to be.
Okay.
It's short and it's.
I have a brief set of notes here. It's about the influence of custom and fashion. Now, potentially, this could be a very major topic, but I don't really think it turns into such a major topic in the book. First of all, what's the difference between custom and fashion? Think of it in terms of clothing. Custom is what everyone wears. Fashion, that which those wear who are of high rank or character. So fashion is kind of like the elite, the upper edge. Style also gets discussed. Style is different schemes of clothing design that may come in or out of fashion or custom. So they're just different schemes. And he talks about how customs can get locked in. He's concerned, maybe not as concerned as he should be, about whether the influence of custom and fashion can corrupt the moral sentiments. And he says that don't worry too much. As regards the moral sentiments, these are much more robust than just our sense of beauty, as in actually clothing design, say. Our moral sentiments are much more robust and not so sensitive to custom and fashion. He discusses some variations in customs and fashions by profession, by how old people are, by nations, by states of society. Yet he says, we readily feel that independent of custom, there is a propriety in the manners which custom has allotted, in a specific example that he discusses. So in other words, he's saying, we can always step back and judge the propriety that the custom is recommending. So in a sense, we have another community right, and its sense of propriety that can judge of the proprieties recommended by custom and fashion. And that's part of this optimism, that they're not going to be misleading. He says he has a great condemnation of slavery. See, he's concerned, he shows some concern, I don't think maybe enough, with whether, societies can completely pervert moral judgment, go in the wrong direction, be vicious and terrible. And he acknowledges that, for example, when he condemns slavery, and he says that is never just. And societies that have that, those are some particular usages that are gross violations. They're something like that's extraordinary, as a way in which custom has gone wrong, essentially. But it's unjust. And he says that on the whole, custom and fashion pervert only particular usages and never sort of the general fabric of the morality of a society. And he makes one of his most notable evolutionary arguments here. He says that if custom and fashion did ever seriously pervert the general moral fabric, that society wouldn't continue or wouldn't prosper. So that's an evolutionary argument about which cultures
evolve,
and in this also, I know a topic that you're interested in, Russ, he condemns infanticide generally, but also says that it's sometimes in some societies accepted as kind of a custom where it's not really frowned on, but he feels that it's basically unjust regardless.
No, I'm not interested in that, actually, but that was an example.
Well, you brought it up.
I brought it up in our off-the-air conversation as an example of something where Smith really goes out on a limb here and he condemns infanticide. Now, I'm kind of I'm joking about it because infanticide hasn't been really in fashion for a while, and the Spartans did it. And I think it bothers Smith that the Greeks, who I think he probably thought had some kind of moral system, that it was common. So it ties into your point earlier about what is proper in one culture may not be proper in another.
Yeah. I don't know if you want to dwell on this. I do think that the condemnation of slavery, it just jumps out and is so strong. Do you want to read it? Or?
No, go ahead.
Okay, he says, there is not a Negro from the coast of Africa who does not, in this respect, possess a degree of magnanimity which the soul of his sordid master is too often scarce capable of conceiving. So he's saying that even in backward societies, savage societies or whatever, the so-called savages actually can feel magnanimity and so on. Do you want to try to find this?
No, more than the master.
Oh, yeah. I mean, he says, which the soul of his sordid master is too often scarce capable of conceiving. Fortune never exerted more cruelly her empire over mankind than when she subjected those nations of heroes to the refuse of the jails of Europe, to wretches who possess the virtues neither of the countries which they come from, nor of those which they go to, and whose levity, brutality, and baseness so justly exposes them to the contempt of the vanquished. What he's saying is that it's the slave traders are like the refuse of Europe, and they their brutality and baseness exposes them to the contempt of those whom they enslave. I mean, it's
the very partial, but some partial spectators, those slaves, are judging the real inferiority of the master.
Absolutely,
it's an incredible passage. You're right. I have to recommend the essays on the econlive.org website by our colleague David Levy and his co-author Sandra Pert on Smith and other classical economists' view of race and how, contrary to some of their other British counterparts, Smith and Mill and others saw every person, poor, of a different race, didn't matter, equally capable of leading their own lives and making their own judgments. And there's a dog that doesn't bark in this book, which is, I noted this in part 6, and you'll correct me maybe because I haven't finished the book, but well into part 6, there is no mention of Smith of any of distinction in all of his observations about human nature. He's made these tremendous claims about propriety, morality, conscience, prudence. There's not a single class statement that those are different among the classes. He never says, of course, this is among me and my friends. Among the poor, they're a bunch of vermin. He doesn't say that. He never makes a distinction that, among the lower classes. And he's writing in England in 1759 through the end of the 18th century in the different editions of this book. There is some discussion about savages, but despite that discussion, which you could take as a racial discussion, it's not particular. I don't know if savage means racial in his world, or just primitive. I assume he meant primitive peoples, sure. which would include a whole range of races. Other than that, a lack of civilization is what he's talking about there. Other than that, Smith is a remarkable egalitarian in his time with respect to class and race. And that passage just really reinforces that. Yeah. And it's really, I think, David Levy and Sandra Peart's essay was an attack on, was a defense of economics against the
charge.
Against the charge. It's the dismal science because it is such a lousy view of mankind and such a crummy view of life. And what they show in that essay is it really was called the dismal science by Carlyle because it was the economists who stood up for the fundamental equality of human beings with respect to each other, as you talked about in the first podcast, that human beings are equals, that much of life takes place among equals. And although he does talk about the sovereign or the king, and occasionally the entrepreneur who's achieved great wealth, most of the action in this book is everybody else, and that includes the destitute, the poor, the Irish, to take an example of a group that was mocked and stereotyped for their lack of moral virtue by other people. But Smith never does that. He has no racial, almost no national stereotypes, and certainly no class stereotypes. And it's the dog that doesn't bark in the book for me. It's really remarkable.
I think that the closest he comes to that is this discussion of custom and fashion, where he does talk some about different walks of life, different professions, different levels of comfort, having different customs, but
judgmental.
It's not judgmental, and the whole discussion of custom and fashion tends to minimize or diminish, right, the effect of that in upsetting the moral fabric, the moral framework. So where it does appear, it's sort of diminished. And he certainly doesn't, he wouldn't in any way disapprove or look down on that certain people, certain classes, ages, what have you, professions have different customs. He's not like, yeah.
I think what's remarkable is that when we find those kind of judgments, say by in the Levy and Peart essay, by people that we tend to respect, people like Tennyson or Dickens, who I hope I'm getting this right, who defended slavery, who defended the oppression of Africans on the grounds that they weren't capable of fending for themselves, or of the Irish, because they can't fend for themselves. It was Smith and Mill and others who said
Spencer.
No. And who?
Spencer.
Who stood up and said, no, they're just like us. They're just enslaved. We need to. They could make their own moral decisions, their own economic decisions. They're perfectly capable. So colleagues of the British economists were paternalists, really of the worst kind. They were condoning the oppression of people in the name of helping them. And
I'm sorry, you say colleagues of the British economists?
Yeah, people. Yeah, I didn't mean colleagues. I meant
critics.
No, I meant they were compatriots. They were fellow intellectuals, fellow writers, fellow cultural critics.
Yeah, but most of the classical political economists, I think,
were on our side, the side of egalitarian, of true equality. And it was the writers and other philosophers,
Ruskin and Carlyle,
exactly,
kind of anti-political economy people.
Correct, who were critical of the economists and political economy, in particular because the economists believed that people were roughly created equal and could fend for themselves. And here Smith's really, I think, also talking about implicitly, because it's the dog that doesn't bark, a moral equality, an ability not just to make rational decisions in your own self-interest and pursue your own goals and dreams and desires, but to do it with propriety and prudence, etc. So, the worst people of that era would say, this group, they're not prudent, the poor, the Irish, whatever it was. But Smith never says that, and it's just extraordinary. that in 1759 he wasn't prey to those views. And, we're not apologizing for, well, it was, in those days. But a lot of people in those days did do it, and Smith didn't.
Yeah, absolutely. Anyway, I think that wraps up part 5, at least in my view, and part 6 is of the character of virtue.
I want to thank Dan Klein for being our guide here for the end of parts 3 and parts 4 and 5, and we'll move on to part 6, and I hope some of 7 in our next podcast.
Thank you.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.